Let's talk about the differences in terms of that use case between Bitcoin and something like Libra. You're talking about Libra is going to submit itself and accept all of the constraints that are put on it. What does that actually do to the use case that they're trying to fulfill?
I mean, if their use case is to make themselves as rich as possible, it doesn't do anything. It's still very, very successful. From that perspective, they're very successful no matter what they do because they have the user base. That's what it's all about. They have the base for the economic activity. But I question the idea that the end goal for Bitcoin or success for Bitcoin should be judged as whether it becomes a reserve currency that's held by governments to settle each other's debts or globally adopted in that way. I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe it happens in a very, very, very long timeline. But I also question whether that's something desirable, because if you end up with a bunch of governments holding excessive amounts of Bitcoin, that gives them power in the system as part of consensus with their economic activity that outpaces that of individuals. And that's not a good outcome. I would much rather Bitcoin be the choice hodl currency of the underrepresented and powerless around the world who use it as an opt-out strategy from the corrupt governments than that it becomes like a new way for governments to have a neutral store of value in which they can stash their reserves. That doesn't appeal to me as an application because once again, it puts the power in governments. In order to do that, they'd have to dump enormous amounts of fiat into Bitcoin, which, would end up enticing a lot of Bitcoin holders to sell their good crypto for shitty fiat.
Based on that, though, it sounds like Libra has some kind of inherent advantages versus the type of thing that we're trying to do with Bitcoin. But at the same time, like, let's take a situation like Cyprus from, 5 years ago when we were kind of just getting started. They had the banking system get locked down and really nobody had Bitcoin. So there was a little bit of activity there, but there was more excitement than there was actual activity. Would Libra have helped in that situation, or would the controls put on it by the local governments and the compliance requirements basically have meant that it would have been locked up just like the rest of the banking system for those people?
It very much depends on whether people had access to Libra before the crisis or not. If people had access to Libra before the crisis, so they had some Libra holdings, then before the government has a chance to take action, they move a lot of their wealth into something like Libra and escape currency controls. Then they shut down Libra in that country. It's basically exactly the same thing you see with controls over the internet in Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. We got to see the first stages of the coup broadcast on TV out of Turkey before they shut down all of the internet and suppressed speech and jailed all of the journalists. But you don't get to see the end stages. So the same thing with Libra. If they ban it before, preemptively, because they know they want to manipulate currency, as India has done, then Libra doesn't help anyone. If they let it in, then they are not able later to easily kick it out or to stop people from using it as an escape hatch, which is exactly why they're not going to let it in. Any government that has any inkling that it might need to manipulate currency in the next decade is not going to allow Libra into its country.
But I also think this escape hatch narrative outside of a decentralized system that is like Bitcoin has been a long-running farce. And I call it that because it's sort of like socialism, where it's this concept that manifests everywhere except reality. And when you look at PayPal, there's actually a phenomenal book called PayPal Wars, which is the history of the founding of PayPal and the first sort of online payment processor. In it, there's about 2 paragraphs of Peter Thiel talking about his vision for PayPal. And he almost word for word describes Bitcoin. And he explicitly says, I want there to be this method for any person in the world to buy in and out of any currency in the world that they want. And we can end currency controls and the destruction of citizens' wealth because they can dynamically get into and out of their national currencies and the this and the that. And you hear it and it sounds perfectly like a description of Bitcoin. And it's almost everything you just said that Libra could be. And then the reality is, because PayPal's a company, the second they want to sell to a market, the first thing they give up is any control that could lead to currency escaping.
I'm going to argue against that just a tiny bit. Yes, this is exactly what Libra did with the white paper, in that all of this idealism will actually get diluted into nothingness as it becomes more profitable. But at the same time, PayPal has had an impact on government currency controls. It does put governments in a very difficult place because PayPal funds a bunch of foreign reserve currency coming into countries from people who are selling services overseas. So if they cut it off completely, they lose a big source of hard currency coming into the country, much more than they lose hard currency leaving the country later on when they're trying to apply currency control. So it's this double-edged sword, which means that Libra will also have that effect. And as a result, it's very difficult to reconcile those two visions. But as you said, the initial glorious ideological vision gets defanged at every shareholder meeting and directors meeting until what's left is, listen, I think it might be better if we just try to change the system from within. The cop-out phrase of every sold-out idealist.
So Bitcoin obviously doesn't have those problems because there is no Bitcoin company. There is no centralized point of control for Bitcoin. Again, like there's been concerns perhaps about attempts to, go after developers or things like that. But it feels like, at least in the current status quo, that isn't really a strong concern.
Only because it wouldn't be effective. If it would be effective, they would have already done it. And they've already done the things that they think are effective, like onerous capital gains accounting procedures and negative propaganda and keeping it in the gray and making it difficult to do on-ramps and off-ramps. If they thought that going after developers would be effective, they'd do it. If they thought that going after miners would be effective, they'd do it. But they know, at least the more sophisticated people within the various agencies that might try to do this, know that this will not be effective. It will simply push some of the middle class, above the board, legitimate activities out of the way and move the rest into the shadows, where it will continue just as strong as before.
I'm looking at this scenario and I hear us saying that it's the sort of thing that is going to naturally emerge, but I'm really wanting to come up with scenarios or potential paths forward that could actually see us go from where we are today to cryptocurrency, Bitcoin or something else, but something fully decentralized as the perhaps not official global reserve currency, but as we said, the implicit one that's just kind of like the obvious best choice and has enough network effect around it that it's useful for that purpose and doesn't have the problems of centralized services like Libra will.
If possible. In the case of cryptocurrencies, Adam had it in the original question. It's not going to be the official currency, it's going to be the de facto market reserve currency. And the reason for that is because the very concept of an official cryptocurrency, with the word official representing authority, declaration, agreement, committee, rather than recognition as simply more efficient, harder currency by the markets, that in itself dies. That in itself is what was killed by the emergence of neutral global cryptocurrencies. The idea that you could anoint something as official and the market status would follow. It doesn't follow anymore. Market status is the only thing that matters, and the official declaration will continue to exist. It will just be irrelevant.